Hi. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be here, although I'm also slightly terrified because I've got my quilt with me, and I'm going to show it in a little bit, you know, show and tell, and I will do show and tell, but I'm a little, I realize I'm with a bunch of experts who do it a lot better than I do, and so you all will go, because it's hand done, and so the stitching is pretty uneven and all that, but nonetheless, I also feel like you're the audience who will appreciate the incredible amount of work that goes into making a quilt. And so you won't just, you'll notice the quilting too, the actual stitching, because most people who don't have anything to do with quilts, they see, oh, the bright colors and the pattern, and they don't look at all of the detail of the stitching. And I know that you'll appreciate that, so I'm thrilled. And I just first to say that I'm a DC girl. I grew up in Tacoma, DC, and then when I was 13, we moved to Wilson Lane in Bethesda. I went to BCC. I know I've been here a long time. My parents were only recently, a couple of years ago, died, and so until recently, I've been coming back to DC, you know, all the time. And but I've never known anything about the quilting world here. I had no idea Capital Quilts existed, and I've been looking around, and I'm one of those people who goes into a quilt store and comes out with a stack of fat quarters because I just can't help it. I can't help myself, and I've already spotted some that I'm going to buy later because they're gorgeous. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, I'm going to really briefly talk about what this book is about and get that out of the way in 2 minutes, because what I really want to, what's so great about today is that we can just talk about quilts the whole time, and that's not normally what I get to do when I meet people to talk about The Last Runaway, because I know that you'll appreciate it and most people don't. So we will mostly talk about quilts and see some quilts, and I'm also going to do some readings, 3 readings from the book that are specifically to do with quilts. So I don't normally read these sections very much either, because they don't, some of them push the story forward and some of them don't, but you of all people will appreciate the details in it. Now, I am probably best known as a historical novelist, and this is my 7th novel. The first 6 novels, by the way, can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah, good. The first 6 novels have all been set in Europe, in France or in England, in Holland, most famously. That's partly because I live in London. I grew up here. I went to Oberlin College, which we'll hear a bit more about in a minute. And after Oberlin, I went over to London thinking I was going to stay for 6 months, and 29 years later, I'm still there. And my husband's English. I'm settled there. And I think when I started writing, I found it easier to set novels in Europe because I was the outsider looking in on these different cultures. And that outside status kind of allowed me to look more objectively. And I was always really nervous about setting a book in the States again. It just seemed too close. Even though I didn't live there anymore, the motherland is too close. You know, it has a very strong hold on my heart, and so I avoided it. But I always knew I eventually I'd want to set a book and have to set a book in the States. And I had the idea for this novel when I was back in Oberlin a few years ago for a meeting, because I'm on a council of alumni doing some advising, and I happened to be there the day Toni Morrison, the novelist, was unveiling a commemorative bench. It's called A Bench by the Road, and it was it's a project that came about because years ago she gave an interview in which she said, you know, there are no monuments to slavery in this country. There are no statues, there's no towers, there's not even a bench by the road where you can go and sit and think about the past. And that idea got taken up, the bench by the road, and they've now started putting commemorative benches in places of historical significance for African Americans. And the first bench was placed on Sullivan Island, which was where a lot of the slave ships coming across the Atlantic ended up disembarking. And the second bench was placed at Oberlin, Ohio, partly because Toni Morrison grew up just up the road in Lorain County, in Lorain, Ohio, but I think also because Oberlin was a really important hub of the Underground Railroad through Ohio. And it also had a history of radicalism, even from its founding in 1833. The college, when it was founded and opened, it was the first college in the country to admit both women and African-American students. And it's always had that kind of radical feeling about it. So in a way, this bench was to commemorate that. And when I was standing there watching her unveil it, it got me thinking about the Underground Railroad, and I thought that would be a wonderful subject to write about because it was a really extraordinary movement, and it came about it was ordinary people doing something extraordinary, and I like to write about that, so it seemed to fit in very well with what I wanted to do. And I ended up, I was a little terrified of making all of my characters American. Even though I was setting in America, I thought, okay, I just need a little toehold in England. So I'll have my main heroine be English. So her name is Honor Bright. She's an English Quaker who, a lot of Quakers worked on the Underground Railroad. She emigrates to Ohio in 1850 with her sister. Her sister is going to marry a man in Ohio, and it's not giving too much away because I think it happens on like page 8. Her sister dies, and Honor is stranded in Ohio alone and has to make her way through Ohio to this community where her sister was going to get married and make a life for herself. And a lot of the book is about the immigrant experience. It's about being a stranger in a strange land and trying to find your way. And there's a lot of Honor looks at America with very critical eyes because she's used to a country that's been populated and domesticated for thousands of years. When she looks out over the landscape in England, it's all hedgerows and green fields. It's all very cultivated and not wild at all. And she gets to Ohio and it's just full of woods and nothing else, and she's terrified of this. And she also finds the Americans very straightforward, practical, blunt. She says they're graceless. The women are graceless. They don't walk well. And I take all of these things that from a lot of the ideas that she had, I took from a book called Domestic Manners of the Americans by Fanny Trollope, who was Frances Trollope was the mother of Anthony Trollope, the author. And for reasons known best to herself, in 1828, she came over to Cincinnati and tried to open a dress shop, and it failed. But she kept a journal, and she published it in 1832, and it was all about how crazy, how strange Americans are, and she was very critical, and it was very funny. So I thought I'd put some of that. And Honor has to, throughout the book, it's really about her learning to become American, to realize that differences aren't necessarily bad; they're just different, and there's no more bigger difference to her than how quilts are made. She's a quilter, a very good quilter, and she does the English style, which is patchwork using templates. As all of you have probably, when you started out making Grandmother's Garden, those using hexagonal templates, putting the fabric around it, making rosettes and into Grandmother's Garden. She did that. She does diamonds. She uses triangles. So it's all that very elaborate and very focused patchwork quilting. She comes to America, and she's in Ohio. In 1850, the big trend at that point was for red and white quilts, applique primarily, floral patterns, a bit like the vines here you see, and that sort of applique, usually using red, sometimes green, on a white background. Honor takes one look at this and goes, oh, applique, oh, vulgar, so vulgar. You know, it's not anywhere near sophisticated as patchwork. And she's like, block pieces, oh, they're okay, but no, not really. And she prefers her own way. And in the end, she has to learn how to make those red and white applique quilts because it's demanded of her. And I chose quilting as the underlying motif or theme in this book because I always like to find something that my characters do with their hands. They spend their spare time doing. So in my last book, It's called Remarkable Creatures. It was about a fossil hunter. And these two women, the two main characters, go out on the beach every day looking for fossils. And in order to be able to write about that, I had to do it myself. When I wrote Girl with a Pearl Earring, I took a painting class so that I could understand how Vermeer handled paint. Of course, everything I painted I then threw away because it's so horrible. But it's very important to do that on-the-job training, so to speak. And I chose quilting because I knew it was something that both English and American women made. And also because it was something really practical. They needed them. They didn't make them to hang them on the walls. They made them to use because it was cold. They needed to keep warm. And yet it was also something that allowed them creativity. It was an outlet of creativity in what was otherwise quite a harsh and difficult life. And so I chose it, and I thought, well, if I'm going to write about quilts, I've got to do it myself because I don't have, I don't know anything about sewing. The only sewing I'd ever done was sewing on buttons. And I decided I better take a class. Now, that's easier said than done in England and in London, because here, quilting is a noble tradition, well established. Lots of, I mean, if I lived near here, I'd be in here all the time taking classes. You're incredibly lucky to have this. But the Capital Quilts is not the only place to do quilting all over the country. And when I was doing research in Ohio, I was amazed at how I'd drive into a small town, and there would be hardly anything, but there'd be a quilt shop. And there'd be women taking classes and making and creating. And I just thought that was fantastic. So, but in London, not so easy. But I was incredibly lucky. A mile up the road from me was a quilt class. So I took that and I did the basics. So the first thing we did was our grandmother's garden rosette. And we made 2 of them. And then we sewed them together into a pincushion, which I still use because I didn't have a pincushion. I didn't have anything. And then the teacher said, I think you better go to the knitting and stitching show in October. There's a big show in London. And buy yourself some quilting needles. She told me all the things I needed, and I bought all kinds of stuff. And that's where my great love affair with fabric began, because I discovered fat quarters. There's something about fat quarters, you know, they don't cost very much. They're $2 or $3. I mean, how can you go wrong? And then before you know it. And the thing is, you have to have a lot of fabric in order to choose what you're doing. That's how I justify it anyway. It's like buying books. You can never have too many books. You can never have too many fat quarters. So I took the class all year. We did Grandmother's Garden. We learned, I made a series of cushions for the kitchen. I made Grandmother's Garden cushion. I made a quilt, Star of Bethlehem cushion, a log cabin, and a bear's paw. So I have 4 of them. And I tended to go for what we'd call the Civil War look, because everything was done by hand. I don't have a sewing machine. I don't know how to use one. I'm kind of scared of it. I'm afraid I'm going to sew over my finger. So I thought, no, I'm not going to buy a sewing machine for this. I have to do what my character, Honor, would have done, which is to sew everything by hand. So the whole everything's by hand. And that was luckily what the quilting class was. So we learned to do that. We learned how to applique. We learned how to make little pom-poms, how to make all kinds of little notions. I made those 4 cushions, and then the class ended, and I was a little distraught because I thought, I haven't really started a cushion. I mean, she did show us also how to quilt, do a little bit of quilting. So I had done all the techniques, but I'd not actually made a quilt yet. And then the class ended, and one of the women in the class was in the Flying Geese, which Lori had co-founded the group. And so she said, why don't you join? We only have 4 people left, because it was primarily a group of Americans often coming and going. So the group had been big, it had expanded, gotten much smaller. So 3 of us from the class joined it, and now there are 7 of us, and we all live locally, so we meet at each other's houses. And it was fantastic for me because particularly 2 of the quilters are really experienced, almost as experienced as Lori, not quite. And Lori helped me with my binding, so thank you for that. But everybody, every week I'd go and I'd get advice, and I decided to make a quilt that I didn't want to do either the applique or that intricate patchwork. I decided to do a kind of happy medium, which was the block pieces. So what I made was this. And I decided also, because I wanted to get it done in like within a year, and I could only really work on it every Monday for a few hours, and sometimes in front of the telly and stuff too. I thought I'll make a lap quilt. So it's not even quite a single size, but this is what I ended up making. This is from all those fat quarters. Here we go. There we go. Yeah, it's not too bad. It's not too bad for a beginner. That's what. What I first did was I just spent months sewing squares, 4 squares, and all of the fabrics are from various different quilt shops, mostly in the States, but also a couple from the Knitting and Stitching Show, some stands, and then, yeah, and then I sewed. I laid them all out when I had enough, and I put them the way I wanted them, and then I cut out all the red, the maroon, and then I sewed. So then I sewed them onto. Sewed these strips like that, and then I sewed that strip onto this, and et cetera, et cetera. Then I sewed that around, and then I had to quilt it. So I kept thinking as I was doing all this quilting, you know, we have these the stencils that you can with the blue pen that you can put all on it, and they didn't have all that back in 1850. They did it in different ways. They had chalk. The chalk would come off, and I don't know how they did it all. But I just spent months and months quilting, and quilted finally the outside. And finally, then I needed some backing fabric. And the problem in the States, which we lay it down like that, the problem in England is that there aren't many quilt shops, and people don't make things anymore. They just buy ready-made clothes. So to get fabric was very difficult. So you're incredibly lucky to have all of that fabric that you can just choose from. So I had to wait until I went on a research trip to Ohio to get the backing fabric. And then I came back and I quilted it all, and then I did the binding, thanks to Lori, and then it was done. And the day it was done, I was almost bereft because I was so used to it. I mean, I was relieved. And actually the first thing I did was I went and knitted a scarf. It took 2 days. Woo! That was so fantastic. Because it's a long haul. It's such a long haul. So, but I felt like I learned a lot. I learned so much about what my own character would have done, how you hold a needle, how you thread a lot of needles at once so you don't have to keep doing that. The types of needles that suited me better, if you prick your finger and you get blood, how you keep that. You got to get rid of it because it'll get it all over it. I had never really understood how you use a thimble, and now I totally get it. And all of those things, and also, possibly most importantly, knots. I learned how to sew without knotting. You don't have to knot. You do the little back stitch, and that's just been a total eye-opener to me. So I could apply that all to Honor and how she sews quilts, how she makes quilts. Honor has been stranded in Ohio and is having to make her way to this little town that her sister's fiancé is living in. She doesn't know where else to go, so she's going to go on to there. And she's been getting a lift from an old man named Thomas. She's in a wagon going through from Hudson to Wellington. And they've been passing through all of very isolated woods, not many people around, this track that they've been following along. And this is a scene in which a quilt sort of saves her. So quilts are for more than just putting on beds in this scene. Now, the one thing that pains me is that I have to use the N-word in this scene. And that goes against everything I have ever been brought up to do. However, people did speak like this, and certainly the slave hunter you're going to meet now, this is exactly what he would have said, so I hope you will forgive me for having to hear it. So, Honor is with Thomas on the wagon, and then they hear a noise. They hear a horse coming up behind them. Then the rider was upon them. He pulled up next to the wagon, and Thomas stopped the gray mare. Honor glanced at the man before folding her hands in her lap and fixing her gaze on them. Even sitting on a horse, it was clear he was very tall, with a leathery, tanned skin of a man who spends his life outside. Light brown eyes stood out in his square, weathered face. He would have been handsome if there was any warmth to his expression, but his eyes were flat in a way that sent a chill through her. She was suddenly very aware of their isolation on this road. She doubted, too, that Thomas carried a gun like the one prominent on the man's hip. If Thomas had similar thoughts, he did not reveal them. "Afternoon, Donovan," he said to the newcomer. The man smiled, a gesture that did not affect his face. "Old Thomas and a Quaker gal, is it?" He reached over and pulled at the rim of Honor's bonnet. As she jerked her head away, he laughed. "Just checking. You can tell the other Quakers you know not to bother dressing up niggers in Quaker clothes. I'm on to that one. That trick's old." He removed his battered hat and nodded at Honor, who stared at him, bewildered by his words, for they made no sense to her. "You don't have to take your hat off to Quakers," Thomas said. "They don't believe in it." "Phuh, I ain't gonna change my good manners just 'cause a Quaker gal thinks different. You don't mind if I take my hat off to you, do you, miss?" Honor ducked her head. "See, she don't mind." The man stretched. Under a brown waistcoat, his collarless white shirt was stained with sweat. "Can we help you with something?" Thomas said. "If not, we have to get along. We've a long road ahead." "You in a rush now, are you? Where you headed?" "I'm taking this young woman with me back to Wellington," Thomas said. "She's come to Ohio from England, but lost her sister in Hudson to yellow fever. You can see from her tears that she's in mourning." "You from England?" Honor nodded. "Say something then. I always like the accent. Go on, say something. What, you too proud to talk to me? Say, 'How do you do, Donovan?'" Rather than remain silent and risk his insistence turning to anger, Honor looked into his amused eyes and said, "How does thee, Mr. Donovan?" "How does I? I does fine, thanky. Nobody's called me Mr. Donovan in years. You Quakers make me laugh. What's your name, gal?" "Honor Bright." "You gonna live up to your name, Honor Bright?" "A little kindness to a girl who has just buried her sister in a strange land," Thomas intervened. "What's in that?" Donovan switched his tone suddenly, gesturing to Honor's trunk in the wagon bed. "Miss Bright's things." "I'll just have a look in it. That trunk's the perfect size for a hidden nigger." Thomas frowned. "It's not right for a man to look in a young lady's trunk. Miss Bright will tell you herself what's in it. Don't you know that Quakers don't lie?" Faster than she could have imagined, Donovan jumped from his horse and onto the wagon. Honor felt a dart of fear in her gut, for he was so much bigger, faster, and stronger than her and Thomas. When Donovan discovered the key was locked, that fear made her pass over the key, which she had kept on a thin green ribbon around her neck during the long journey. Donovan opened the lid and lifted out the quilt Honor had brought to America. She expected him to set it aside, but instead he shook it out and draped it over the wagon bed. "What's this?" he asked, squinting at it. "I never seen writing on a quilt." "It is a signature quilt," Honor explained. "Friends and family made quilts and signed them. It was a gift to mark my move to America, to say goodbye." Each square consisted of brown and green and cream squares and triangles, with a white patch in the middle, signed by the maker. Originally begun for her sister, when Honor decided at the last minute to go to America as well, the makers rearranged the configuration of names so that hers was in the central square, with family members in squares around it, and friends beyond those. Quilted in a simple diamond pattern, it was not especially beautiful, for the work varied according to the skill of each maker, and it was not designed the way Honor would have chosen. But she could never give it to anyone. It had been made for her to remember her community by. Donovan studied the quilt for so long, Honor began to wonder if she had said something wrong. "My mother made quilts," he said at last, running his fingers over a name. "Nothing like this, though. Hers had a big star in the center made out of lots of little diamonds." "That pattern is called the Star of Bethlehem." "Is it now?" Donovan looked at her. His brown eyes had thawed a little. "I have made that pattern myself," she added. "They are not easy, because it is difficult to put together the points of the diamonds. The sewing must be very accurate. Thy mother must have been skilled with her needle." Donovan nodded, then grabbed the quilt and stuffed it back in the trunk. Locking it, he jumped down from the wagon. "You can go." Without a word, Thomas flicked the reins, and the gray mare sprang into life. A minute later, Donovan rode up alongside them. "You settlin' in Wellington?" "No," Honor answered. "Faithwell, near Oberlin. My late sister's fiancé is there." "Oberlin!" Donovan spat, then pressed his heels into the stallion's belly and flew past them. His horse's hoofbeats remained in the air, quieter and quieter for many minutes, until at last they faded away. "All right, then," Thomas said softly. Stamping twice, he flicked the reins over the mare's back again. He did not hum, however, for the rest of the journey. It was only miles later that Honor realized Donovan had not given her back the key to her trunk. Now, the next scene I'm going to read is going into a little bit more about the differences between the types of quilting, the types of quilts made in England and in Ohio at the time. Honor makes it to Faithwell, and she has to live with her her sister's fiancé and another woman, and it's a rather odd arrangement for a while anyway. And she doesn't like Abigail very much, the woman, but they have to. One afternoon, they decide to sit and quilt for a bit. So this is what Honor sees about her quilting. The next afternoon, when Abigail decided they had done enough housework for the day, she settled into the rocker on the front porch with a quilt she was working on and a bowl of new cherries from a tree behind the house. Fetching her sewing box, Honor joined Abigail. She had some bits of fabric from cloth from home, a few shapes she had pieced, and fabric tacked around templates ready to be sewn. Most women who made quilts had half-started projects, waiting for the right moment to be taken up again. Honor looked through the rosettes and stars she had already made, wondering what she should do with them. The shapes and colors, brown and green rosettes made from Grace's and Honor's old dresses, the beginning of a Bethlehem star in different shades of yellow, reminded her of England and seemed foreign in the bright American sunlight. She did not think she could make something from them that would complement Ohio life. However, she was not ready to sit with pen and paper and work on a new design. It was too soon, and she needed a clear head and inspiration. She glanced at Abigail's quilt. It was a style Honor could not imagine making, a floral applique of red flowers and green leaves spilling out of a red urn, sewn onto a white background. Honor had always preferred patchwork to applique, feeling that to sew pieces of fabric on top of large squares of material was somehow cheating, a shortcut compared to the harder task of piecing together hundreds of bits of fabric, the colors blended so that the whole was graduated and unified and made a pleasing pattern. Though some quilters despaired of the rigid geometry and the accuracy required for making patchwork, to Honor it was a happy challenge. Since coming to America, she had seen these appliqued quilts, usually red and white, sometimes with a bit of green as well, everywhere, in inns and guest houses, hanging on lines and over porch railings for airing. They were bright, cheerful, unsophisticated. Some of the quilting patterns were beautifully executed, of feathers or vines or grapes, sometimes padded so that the pattern stood out, but the overall look was not to her taste. The block piecing style of other American quilts was a little more appealing. Such a quilt consisted of a dozen or more blocks made up of squares and triangles set out in patterns with names like bear's paw, monkey wrench, flying geese, or shoe fly. More challenging than the appliqued quilts, they were still too simple for Honor. She preferred her templates. However, she must work on something, piece more shapes she might use later when her head was clear and she had longer stretches of time. She began threading needles. She had poked 5 threaded needles into her pincushion when she felt Abigail's eyes on her. "What is thee doing?" Abigail demanded. "Why so many needles?" I get them ready so that I do not have to stop each time I run out of thread." "Now, isn't that efficient?" Abigail said, in a tone that suggested efficiency was not something to be aspired to. Honor pinned together 2 green and brown hexagons, already tacked to templates, and began a quick overhand stitch in white thread, her preferred color for sewing, whatever the color of the cloth. She paused at the end of the row to fit in another hexagon, run the thread under the cloth, and began sewing, 2 sides now. Abigail was staring again. "How does thee sew so fast?" "I keep my thread short." Honor had noticed that when Abigail threaded her needle, she cut off thread as long as her arm. Abigail picked up one of the rosettes Honor had already made. "Look at those stitches," she declared, pulling at the seams. "They're so even. I haven't seen stitches that fine since I was a girl." She crinkled its petals. "Is that paper in there?" "Yes. Thee has not made patchwork using paper templates." "No. In England, we sew cloth around paper shapes to keep them accurate, otherwise they won't fit when we sew them together to make the quilt. See?" Honor handed Abigail some paper hexagons. "But then the comfort will crackle." "We take them out once we have sewn them all together." Honor loved removing the paper templates from a finished piece, a design that had been stiff and formally held in place by paper, growing soft and comfortable. Abigail was peering at the paper templates. "10-pound flour," she read. "1 cake rennet. I did not want, away from Dorchester. Will soon return." Honor froze. Even as Abigail read out the scraps of words, she knew it was in Samuel's hand. A brief note telling her he was visiting relatives in Exeter and would be back in a week. That letter had seemed unimportant at the time, enough that Honor sacrificed it for use as templates. She held out her sewing box so that Abigail could put the templates back. Abigail took her time, though, continuing to inspect the words on the scraps of paper while Honor waited. At last, she dropped them in. "I prefer applique," she said, smoothing out her square of red and green and white. "It makes a simple, pretty comfort." Honor could see that her stitches were ragged and of different lengths. It was no surprise that her sewing was so uneven, for to make even stitches, the seamstress herself had to be steady. Abigail tended to hunch over her patchwork, her fingers and thread a-snarl, and sew a few stitches before abandoning it to look down the road towards the houses near the general store or to get up for a drink of water. Honor knew such restless sorts, even among Quakers, for she had taught several to sew in Bridport. She attributed her own fine sewing to the prolonged periods of silence at meeting for worship. These had made her thoughts level and her hands steady, which was reflected in her own even stitching. But it seemed that silence did not have that effect on everyone's sewing. Now, after I made this, my quilting group, I think when the book came out, they thought, that's it, she's going to leave and not come back because she's gotten what she wanted. And it's not the case at all. I continue to go almost every Monday, and I started another quilt. And I decided I was going to try to make the quilt that I'd made up in my head and written about in this book. She meets a woman named Mrs. Reed, who's an African-American woman who was a runaway herself from Virginia and ends up in Oberlin as a free black, as they were called. And she works on the Underground Railroad, and she and Honor get to know each other a little bit. And Mrs. Reed is quite a tough character. So Honor goes to see her. Honor's own family, she ends up marrying, and her family doesn't want her to help runaways because it's dangerous. You can be fined, you can be imprisoned, and they don't want her to, and they finally convince her to stop. And she's gone to Mrs. Reed's house in Oberlin to tell her that she can't help her anymore. And so she tells Mrs. Reed, and then Mrs. Reed says, this is just a brief scene where she goes in to look at her to help out with the baby. Mrs. Reed hears her granddaughter crying in the other room, and she says, "Could you go see to this baby?" So this is what Honor sees when she goes into the front room. There was only a ribbon of light from the window to see by as Honor crept in, and before going to the baby, she pulled open the curtains. As sunlight flooded the room, the baby turned her head from the pile of bedclothes she was lying on, caged in by a variety of wooden chairs. She caught sight of Honor, widened her glistening eyes, and added a high-pitched scream to her crying. She was a plump baby with tight black ringlets, fat cheeks, and a bow-shaped mouth. As Honor approached, she rolled over in terror and began flailing arms and legs like a turtle caught on a rock. Honor moved a chair aside, crouched down next to the baby, and laid a hand on her back. "There now, my dear, how is it with thee?" She tried to imagine the bump lodging in her own womb, turning into this squirming, squalling being. It didn't seem possible. Then she noticed the quilt. Honor was now familiar with most American quilt styles. She might not like the colors or pattern, but they were designed with care. The cloth chosen from the best fabrics available, even if made from scraps of old clothes. The patterns were deliberate, and whether simple or complex, clearly thought out. Mrs. Reed's quilt was made up of strips of cloth sewn together to form rough squares in blue, gray, cream, and brown, with the odd yellow strip thrown in. They were of wool or linsey, cut from coats, blankets, shirts, petticoats, and were faded and worn. The cover had not been quilted, but tie knots of brown yarn had been placed at the center of each square. Honor flipped over a corner of the quilt. It was lined with brown linsey, cut with thin orange stripes. Running her hands over the squares, she pulled too tight together to inspect the stitching. It was even, without being overly precise. What struck her about the quilt was the same thing she had noticed about Mrs. Reed's front garden. The placement of the colors seemed unplanned, and yet there was something pleasing about them. The gray brought out the clear beauty of the blue. The blue deepened the brown and made the cream rich and clean. The gray and cream should not go together, yet they looked as natural as two rocks side by side. And every now and then a bit of yellow popped out, making the other colors seem uniform. It felt as if there was an overall pattern that tugged at Honor's eyes, yet when she tried to find it, the patchwork fell back into random pieces. Bright, rich, spontaneous, Mrs. Reed's quilt made the red and green applique quilts favored by Ohio women look childlike, and Honor's own careful patchwork contrived and overcomplicated. Now, I based that on Gee's Bend quilts. You probably recognize I think of Mrs. Reed as a prototype of the Gee's Bend quilts that you probably know from the 1930s from Alabama, which have that incredibly vibrant randomness to them. And I think of them as the jazz of the quilt world. They're really, really special. And I thought, I'm going to try to do that. So here's my little, I've just started. Yes, you can have a good laugh now. So here's what I'm trying to do. There we go. There we go. And there's the little yellow, little yellow flash now and then. And I did this much, and then I said, oh, I'm not sure I can face an entire quilt that looks like this. So I'm thinking of doing rather like this, putting some plain cloth in between and having them be like 4 or 5, 6 blocks like this. But we'll see. We'll see how I get on. And my quilting group, when I came and said, oh, ladies, I just don't think I can do this anymore, they said, yes, you can, but you need to have another project too. I was just talking about this with somebody earlier. As a novelist, I tend to write one thing at a time. And, but then I realized actually, even when I'm writing a novel, I often will get something else come in, like a short story or something very short, or I go do an event that has nothing to do with the novel I'm working on. And those are my palate cleansers, or the sorbet between two courses. And I thought I need some sorbet. So I've got all my fat quarters from all over the place. And I was just looking at the beautiful batiks in the other room, and I have some. And my quilting lady said, why don't you just do something different? Like, don't you have somebody who's having a baby? You could make a cot quilt, because that's small and it doesn't take long, and the bright batiks are really good for that sort of thing. So I thought, that's what I'm going to do. Now I just have to figure out a pattern. And I'm not very good at following patterns, but maybe I ought to actually try that instead of, because the great thing about this is that I don't, and Lori said, just close your eyes when you're cutting, because you don't want it to be measured. And so I just the way I do one of these squares is I just think, what shall I start with? So I grab some, and then I just put things sort of next to it, and I just cut strips, and they end up being really very random and different and kind of wonky. And I like it like that. But sometimes you need something very different. So I think I am actually going to get a pattern for a cot quilt. So if anybody has any ideas, it's something that you've done that you've really liked, come and tell me afterwards. And I will be, yes, I'm in the obvious place for that. I'm probably going to get 100 different patterns. So that's what I'm going to do. And I think you all know that. I saw a lot of nodding, that you need to have different things on the go to keep you going, and because we all go through those points where we kind of slow down and just think, am I doing the right thing? Are these the right colors? Do I need an entire bed full of that? I don't know, you know, and we need to refresh ourselves. I think I'm going to open the floor to questions now because I've talked enough. So if you have any comments or questions, yes, I suspect you will. Yes, yes.
Sorry, Tracy, if you could just repeat the question that gets asked.
Yes, I will repeat it so everybody can hear it. And you are wearing something really gorgeous. Did you make that?
I did make it.
Cut it afterwards. Gorgeous.
There are so many people in this room, and I just know that each of them have stories like you do about how they get started in quilting. And
Yeah.
my question to you is, how did you get started writing so beautifully in your life?
The question is, how did I get started writing? I took off some of the compliments at the end. How did I get started writing? I was always a reader as a child, and I used to go to the library. We lived in Tacoma, not Park, but Tacoma, DC, and there was a library within walking distance. And every week I would go to the library, and Mrs. Carney, the children's librarian, would have a book set aside for me. I would get that book plus a few others, and I would go home and I'd read them all, and then I'd next week take them back and get more. And Mrs. Carney, I have a lot to thank her for, because she would slowly introduce more complicated and different types of books to me, and it kept me, it really sustained me. So I loved books, which meant I just thought, well, when I grow up, I want to be involved with books. And that means either I'm going to be a librarian or I'm going to be a writer. And I kind of went back and forth between the two. I didn't write a lot. I mean, in high school, I was at BCC, and I was the literary editor of the editor of the literary magazine, Chips. And I wrote a couple of things for that. But it's not that I lost my confidence, but I discovered publishing. I mean, when you're a kid, you know nothing about publishers and the fact that there's a company behind a book. Well, maybe not so much anymore, but there used to be. And so I thought, by the time maybe I lost my way, didn't lose my way, but I just thought, well, maybe I'll go into publishing and I'll publish books. So when I went to Oberlin, I did an English degree. And there's a wonderful creative writing department there, but I didn't write anything. I didn't take any classes, I didn't write anything. And then in my 20s, I did go into publishing in London, but I started writing short stories on the side at night. I don't know exactly why I did it, I just kept having ideas for stories, and I thought I wanted to communicate them somehow. So I would work on them at night and then work on other people's words during the day. And eventually I got bored with working on other people's words and wanted to work more on my own. So I ended up quitting my job and doing an MA in creative writing. And that was the real turning point for me, because always I had written short stories in between the cracks of time that I had. And, but that gave me a whole chunk of a year just to work on writing. And that was where I had the idea for my first novel, The Virgin Blue, and I started writing that there. And then it slowly built up over time. And then once I finished that, I was still, after I finished the MA, I went back to editing part-time and writing part-time, and then I wrote Girl with the Pearl Earring, and everything shifted. I didn't have to edit anymore. I just wrote full-time, so it grew from there. Yes?
I mean, first of all, I read, I think, all your books, and they're all wonderful.
Thank you.
Very, very much. They've been great. 2 questions. The English style of piecing that your character does, I was trying to really understand that. I know how to make grandmother's flower gardens with pieced hexagons, but does she use paper with her templates, and then you, for like a block?
Okay, so that's the first question. What's the second?
How did you learn about hat making?
Hat making, okay. The first question is, how exactly do you do a grandmother's garden rosette? What are the templates?
Not for that,
Right.
for a pieced block. Did she do other things besides grandmother's garden?
No. Honor, what does Honor do? She persists for a long time in making Grandmother's Garden and Star of Bethlehem Star and the things that you would use paper templates for. And later in the book, have you read the book yet? Oh, you have? Well, then you know that I didn't read the scene, but there's a big long scene when she's going to get married. She's meant to have 13 quilts. Well, 12 quilts, and then they make a 13th one. And she doesn't have that kind of number. So they have to do this kind of negotiation about the quilts and what they're going to do. And she has to make some quick ones. And she ends up making the applique quilts are a lot quicker, so she makes those. So she knows about the block pieces, but she doesn't make those. She either makes the English or she does the applique when she's forced to. Now, your second question is, how did I learn about hat making? Well, when in the book, there is a milliner named Belle Mills, and who lives in Wellington, not far from where Honor ends up. And Honor stays with her for a few days and helps her sewing and hat making until she goes on, and they become friends. When I wrote the first draft of the book, Belle Mills had a very small part in the book, and towards the end of the draft, I realized I needed her. I wanted her too, because she's such a fun character. She really tells it like it is, and she plays really crucial part in the book. And so when I redrafted it, I made her part much bigger. And I realized, Honor stays with her a few days and helps her with hats, so I thought, I've got to learn how to make hats. Not in quite, but by that time, I didn't have the time to do a hat making class, although I found one. I went to see a class. There is a milliner in London. There are a lot of them because the English are crazy about hats. So for every wedding and horse race and whatever, meeting the Queen or whatever it is you're going to do. So there are a lot of hats to be made. And there's a milliner. Her name is Rose Corey, and I went to see her while she was with this hat making class, and I just asked her a lot of questions, took a lot of photos, and I read. She gave me some suggestions of things to read. I went to see a hat curator at the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, who also gave me some stuff to read. So, and then I went online and discovered the amazing world of hats on the internet. It's not as big as quilts on the internet, which is, you could get lost for months in the quilts on the internet, but that helped me as well. So I had, because there isn't so much hat making in the book, I didn't have to do as much research as I did for quilts. But I now know how you put together a bonnet and how you put together a hat and all that. So that's how I did it.
Thank you.
Yes?
Can you touch on the question of coding in African American quilts?
Hidden in plain view. The question is about coding in African American quilts. There was a book that came out several years ago called Hidden in Plain View. I'm sure a lot of you have read it or at least know about it. And the idea is that there were quilts that were used both by African Americans and also white Americans along the Underground Railroad to give signals to runaways. So if a bear's paw quilt was hung out over on the porch and the runaway saw it, they'd know they'd have to follow the bear trail or something like that. I read the book because a lot of people told me about it, and I thought, wow, this would fit in perfectly with my book. And then I went online and I discovered that it's incredibly controversial because the woman, there's an African American woman, I think it was in North Carolina, the woman who wrote it, the genesis of it was that the woman went to buy a quilt from this woman, very old woman, who was selling quilts, and she said, there's stories about these quilts that my parents and my grandparents told me, and in our family it's known as, there's a whole code of the different usually block pieces. And so she met with her several times and talked it through, and then wrote a book about it and became a bestseller, and she went on Oprah. But quilt historians say, look, there's no corroboration of this. This is just one woman, one family saying this is what happened, and they had never heard of this before, and no other families, there's no other evidence that this has happened elsewhere. So there was some quilt historians have suggested that this woman was just spinning her along for whatever reason. I think it's something we all want to believe in because it just sounds so cool. What a cool way to use quilts, and an amazing, it just, and quilts were so ubiquitous and you could imagine them being used as signals, but I just decided I was not going to get dragged into that, so I didn't take it in the end. Yeah.
Could I ask, you formulate a character first and then go looking for things that she does, and then sit and close your eyes and type it away?
Right. How do I do it? How do I do it? The question is, do I form a character first and then does the plot come after that? Is that the... it's a bit of both, really, but I think I do start with a character, and it's very important for me to get the name right, and I knew immediately I wanted her to be called Honor. I've always been fascinated with that as a name. It's more common in this, it's not common at all now, but it's more common if it's used at all in England, and I thought it's just such a tricky name to have as a first name. I mean, how do you live up to that? To be honorable all your life. And in a way, this book is all about the principles of being opposed to slavery in a country like England, where there is no slavery. Then emigrating to America, which was, unfortunately, the whole economic system was founded on it. And it's one thing to say, I'm opposed to slavery, but another thing to put your principles into practice, and whether people felt they could do that or not. So it seemed to me that Honor was the perfect name for her. So and then I got Bright is a Quaker name in the States, in England, and I thought it made sense. So you get the name, and I also happened to find a photo when I was looking online at 19th century photographs of women. There's just a gorgeous woman's face. I don't have it with me, but a woman with a very clear, open face, and I just imagined her looking like that. And so I knew that she was going to be quiet, and that she's Quaker. She values silence the way I do. I know I don't sound like I do, but I actually really like being quiet sometimes. So I had all of those, and then it's almost like I place her in a situation and then see where it takes me. So I don't always know the points of the plot and how they're going to go. I usually know what emotional journey she's going to take. I know what she's like at the beginning, her character, and what she changes into at the end, but I don't always know the plot that's going to lead her there. That comes with time. Yes.
I'd like to ask about your quilt.
Yeah.
Did you quilt it on a frame? Did you do it all by yourself, or did you have a bee?
A bee, yeah, that's great. Okay, the question is how I made it and the quilting. I made it. I quilted it all by myself, and I used a hoop, an embroidery hoop or a quilting hoop, and nobody helped me. I didn't have a bee because I don't have a frame big enough. I would love to have had a bee, or in the book they call it a frolic, which is, I just thought it was such, I mean, I like quilting bee, but a quilting frolic is just, oh, it's so wonderful. It's just so, yeah, so you can just imagine. No, I sadly didn't have a frolic, and because I didn't have the space or the frame to do it. But I love the idea of that. I always loved, and there's a frolic or two in the book, and I love the idea of all these different people sitting around, and everybody's hand being a little bit different. And Honor complains about that, of course, because she's a bit of a complainer, and she doesn't like, because she's such a good quilter, and she does double-handed quilting, which is from below, and she's really, really even. And she points out that if you look on the back, her quilting is as good on the back as on the top. And she when she's going to get married, they make a wedding quilt for her really quickly, a whole cloth quilt. So it's just one big sheet. So it's all about the quilting, and but the hands vary with something like that, as they always will. And so she notices that. So yeah, I just had my own hand, I'm afraid, and just a little in my lap doing that. Yeah.
Did you research the batting, or did you just buy batting?
Did I research the batting, or I just bought batting in a quilt shop in Ohio, in Amherst, Ohio, and it's not synthetic. I really liked the cotton, the organic cotton. It felt so good. And I know everybody says the synthetic's actually better for the quilting part of it, and it's true that when I was quilting this, tufts would come through as I was doing it, so that was a bit, but I preferred the feel of it, so that's what I used. Yes?
I have a question about as a writer.
Yeah.
Some people tend to, especially when you're working with young children, introducing them to writing, write about what you know.
Yeah.
And then as they go along,
Yeah.
they branch out from there. When you started writing, did you write about what you knew or things that interest you that you didn't know a lot about?
The question is, do I write what I know or do I write what I'm interested in? It's so perfect that you should be asking this because I'm here for 2 weeks. I'm leaving Washington tomorrow, but I'm going to Ohio for 2 weeks, and I'm doing book events there. I'm doing research for the next book, and I've also got my Oberlin 30th reunion to go to, and it's the same time as commencement, and they have asked me to be the commencement speaker. Woo! Which is terrifying. Can you imagine standing up in front of a bunch of 21-year-olds and trying to say something meaningful to them? It's really, really hard because they don't want to know, they don't want to hear. And I decided I'd give them pieces of advice, writing advice as applied to life. And the first one I do is don't write what you know, write what you want to know, write what you're interested in. And it's really, and when I apply it to life, I say it's about branching out and not being predictable and not always staying with the same thing and finding out about the world because the world is so interesting. And I firmly believe you should write what you're interested in, not what you know, because otherwise it'll all be autobiographical. And as I say to the kids in my speech I'm writing, you're not as interesting as you think you are. You know, and there's a lot more out in the world that's interesting. They're not going to like that too much, but they'll get over it. They'll get over it. It's a nice thing to say to 21-year-olds. It's so true. I've always felt, when I did, the first novel I wrote was a perfect example. It's half contemporary, half historical. And the contemporary bit is of a 20-something American woman who goes to live in southern France and finds out about her family history. And I didn't intend it to be autobiographical, but a lot of people, because I don't live in France, but there are a lot of elements of her that are in me, I guess. And I don't think that part of the book was as successful as the historical part, which really wasn't me at all. And nobody ever asks me if my historical writing is autobiographical. And I found it much more interesting to find out about what I didn't know anything about, which was 16th century French Huguenots. I knew nothing about them. And ever since then, I've written historically, and I've found out about 17th century Holland, 15th century France, early 20th century England, all kinds of Victorian cemeteries, medieval tapestries, fossils. I knew nothing about fossils. So all of that, it's like, for me, and now quilts. If you had said to me 5 years ago I was going to learn to make quilts, I would have just laughed. I knew nothing about quilts. It just didn't, and now I can't get enough of them. So I think that writing what you're interested in or what you want to know about expands you as a writer, as a person, and it can only be good. The other thing is that it's a long journey to write a novel, and if you write only about what you know, you can get kind of bored with it, whereas you never get bored finding out new things. Yes? Yeah?
Who do you like to read?
Who do I like to read?
When you sit down to read just for yourself,
Yeah.
who do you like to read?
I like to read all kinds. I generally read English and American writers, though not deliberately, but not by, it just happens. I more often read women than men, though again, it's not deliberate, it just sort of happens. I do like historical writing. I love Rose Tremaine, Sarah Waters. I love Ann Tyler. She's not historical, but I love her. Toni Morrison, of course, and there's a huge debt to Beloved in this book, really, because when I knew I wanted to write about Ohio and runaway slaves, I knew I've got to reread Beloved, and it's so beautifully written, and it's so, I decided, I read it so I make sure I didn't try to copy it, because it's not fair, you know, I can't, yeah.
Are you familiar with Geraldine Brooks?
Yes, I love Geraldine Brooks.
I love his historical fiction, and
Yeah.
I loved all of her books.
Yes, I loved, she's written Year of Wonders, March, People of the Book,
Right.
Yeah.
and I just think she does wonderful. I'd love to be like her. Yeah, I try. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
What is your next book going to be about?
What is my next book going to be about? Well, it's all in a really formative state. It's a bit nebulous, but I'm definitely writing about trees. Trees and their how we take them with us, as almost trees as migrants. How they're brought, how they're traded and brought back and forth. It's going to be set between America and England, and in different time periods. But the one I'm researching in Ohio is Johnny Appleseed, because he is a very misunderstood folk hero. I read this wonderful book by Michael Pollan called Botany of Desire, and there's a whole section on apples in the book. And he talks about how Johnny Appleseed was he gave and sold saplings grown from seeds to settlers. And when you move, this is in Ohio and Indiana, and when you got land in those places at the time, you were often, one requirement was that you had to plant an orchard to indicate your intentions to settle there. And the apple trees grown from seed produce sour apples for the most part. If you want sweet eating apples, you have to graft it from a sweet tree. And but Johnny Appleseed mostly sold saplings, seeds and saplings, and that meant those apples were for cider and applejack, not for eating. But in the early 20th century, the Temperance Society took over, hijacked his reputation and changed it, according to Michael Pollan. They made him into this, promoting healthy eating, and they just left aside the botany. And I thought, this is fascinating. Also, he was a Swedenborgian. He followed Emanuel Swedenborg, who was this very strange Swedish philosopher, 18th century, who believed in free love and sort of pantheistic. And Johnny Appleseed, we all know he wore a sack. He went barefoot. He had a tin pot on his head. He slept on the floor and out in the woods. And he was a pretty strange guy. So the book is not about him. He appears in it briefly, but it's about the section I'm writing in Ohio is set in the Black Swamp in the 1820s, when most of the rest of Ohio was being settled, and this was the bit that took the longest to be settled because it was in a swamp. And he sold trees there, and it's about an argument between a husband and wife, one wanting to make one wanting the sour apples, one wanting the sweet. So that's that section, and then it goes on from there in different directions. Yeah.
I have a question about remarkable creatures. I was getting some books from the library, and on a rack near the checkout stand there was this book, and since it had Tracy Chevalier on it, I picked it up. I was just fascinated by the subject matter. It's about fossil hunting. How did you choose that subject, and how did you research that one?
The question was about my last novel, which was called Remarkable Creatures, and how did I come up with the subject. It's about a woman named Mary Anning who existed, who was a fossil hunter in early 19th century England. And she was remarkable because she was working class and a woman working in an arena that was male-dominated, middle-class male-dominated science. I mean, she had no formal education, and yet she discovered on the beach near Lyme Regis some of the most important and earliest dinosaur fossils in England. And I learned about her when I took my son, who was about 7 at the time, to a dinosaur museum, a little place called Dorchester in Dorset. And in the corner, because she's from Dorset, there was a display about her. And it talked about her, and I thought, God, she's such an interesting character, because she really was a woman out of time, her own time. And also, as a baby, she was struck by lightning and survived it. And her parents, her family, used this in a kind of mythology about her to explain why she was so different from them. They said, she had been really sickly, and then the electricity made her really lively and intelligent. And I thought, what a great way to explain genius, So I thought it's the perfect first scene for a novel. So I came out of that dinosaur museum thinking, I've got to write about her. I knew absolutely nothing about fossils, as much about fossils as about quilts. So I had to find out about it, and now I love them.
I have a question about one of your other books. The one about the blind tapestry weaver?
Yeah, The Lady and the Unicorn.
So I read that, and I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't quite get to the point where I believed that a blind person could tell what color
Yeah.
it was just by touching it.
Okay, this is a very specific question, which I'm not sure everybody will understand, but I'll try to. In The Lady and the Unicorn, there is a blind character who can tell that she's a weaving family, and she can tell the difference between different dyes from what she feels. And I thought of that idea, and then I asked some blind people. And they said, oh, absolutely. Wow. Yes, absolutely. You can tell the feel of different dyes based on, they all have a slightly different feel to them. So it was something that I had an idea of, and then I checked it, and it was, lo and behold, there you go. I feel like I've been ignoring people in the back, and I'm also aware that we probably maybe have time for a couple more questions, one or two more questions. Yes?
How did you choose the other really important historical figures who are in your books as sort of the secondary figures to the main heroine?
Right.
How did you choose the other?
So the question is, how did I choose the other important characters in my books who actually existed? Do you mean Vermeer and William Blake? And okay, with Girl with the Pearl Earring, it was a matter of loving the painting and wondering what the relationship was between the painter and the model. And so I didn't choose it; it chose me, really. With William Blake, I wrote a novel called Burning Bright, which I was fascinated by William Blake, and I'd gone to an exhibition of his work at the Tate Gallery in London in 2000. I was walking around it, and it had all his poetry, and it had all his printing press, and all of his paintings, and all brought together. And I just looked at it all and thought, this guy was nuts. I have got to figure out, I've got to write a novel about him to try to understand him. And so that's what I did. And I don't think I did understand him in the end. That was a hard one. But I knew that I didn't want him to be the main character. I sidelined him just the way I did Vermeer. I thought enough has been written about them, so let's look at them from other characters' points of view. So with William Blake, I created some neighbors who live near him, and it became about them and their relationship to him. As with Girl with the Pearl Earring, the maid was the main character and her relationship to Vermeer, so he was slightly in the background. So that's how I did it. One more question? Yes?
Do most people pronounce your name correctly?
Oh, that's a really easy question. Do most people pronounce my name correctly? No. My last name is Chevalier. And people say Chevalier, Chevrolet, whatever, all that. So in England, they tend to a little bit more pronounce it correctly because more people there, most people in England have had to learn French at school, so they sort of know it. Here, it's all over the place. Pardon?
Maurice.
It's like Maurice Chevalier, yes. But I'm not related, sadly. However, my dad was Doug Chevalier, who was the photographer of the Washington Post for 35 years. So you would have seen a lot of his photos. He covered Watergate. He covered everything. And so that's the famous Chevalier in the family. Yes.
So that's your real name.
Oh yeah, Chevalier is my real name. Yes, yes, yeah. On that note, I'm going to say thank you so much, and I'm happy to sign books. Thank you. Thank you.